Nothing like some Indiana Jones for your Mother's Day. A classic scene from a classic movie. Now, what do we call those little golden statue things that Indiana Jones is after in this scene? What do we call them? Idol. It's an idol, a little golden idol, presumably used in the worship practices of some kind of tribal religion. And sometimes when we hear the word idol, we might picture something kind of like that. Or maybe we think of idol in a more modern context, someone like who's really famous and or respected. Sometimes we refer to them as idols, like your favorite sports star, movie star, music star, whatever. We might think of the TV show American Idol, which I had to check and see if it was still on TV, because I haven't watched it in years. But it is still on TV. But what if I told you that idols, as the Bible talks about them, encompass a lot more than the things I just mentioned? And when the Bible talks about idolatry, it's way more relevant to our lives than some people think. To explain what I mean, I'm going to first talk about the 10 Commandments. Whether you've been a church person for a long time or not, you've probably at least heard of the 10 Commandments. Maybe you can recite them from memory. I learned that when I was a kid. The 10 Commandments were first given to the Israelite people through Moses after God brought them out of slavery in Egypt. They are a part of God's law. It's not the entire law, but they kind of summarize it. It's the beginning of God's law. This is God giving us kind of his ethical code. Now, when I was a kid, memorizing the list of 10 Commandments, I kind of thought about the 10 Commandments as just like a list of rules that I was supposed to follow, and if I did, I'd get to go to heaven. That was well and good when I read commandments like do not murder. Like I didn't think I was in much danger of murdering somebody. Do not steal, okay. Do not commit adultery, that's fine. I didn't know what adultery was, so I didn't think I was going to do it. Honor your father and mother. That one was a little tougher, okay? And do not covet, that's another one. I just didn't know what it meant. I thought it was fine, and then I learned what it meant, and I realized I do it all the time, right? Other commandments I didn't think applied to me at all. Like there's one about graven images. Like what even is that? Maybe it's talking about those Indiana Jones style idols. When I got a little older though, I found out that's not really the purpose of the 10 Commandments. It's not that the better we are at keeping them, the better chance we'll have for heaven. In fact, the New Testament says that one of the purposes of the law, including the 10 Commandments, is to show us how incapable we are of keeping it, of being good enough for heaven on our own. And that's why we need the grace of Jesus. But the 10 Commandments are still very valuable because it's one of the main passages we turn to that shows us the standard, God's standard, the bar. It helps us understand what sin is so that then we can repent from it. But in this series, we're not going to focus on all 10 of the commandments. I think that'd be a great thing to do, but that's not what we're going to do this time. Instead, we're going to zero in on just one. The very first one. And that's because I think it's extremely important, and it's a commandment that can be quite easy to break without even realizing it. So here it is. This is Exodus chapter 20, starting with verse 1. And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. Now, don't get the idea here that God is saying we can have other gods just as long as he's first. That word before can also be translated besides, as in you shall have no other gods besides me. And we know from countless other passages in the Bible, Old and New Testament, that God is saying he is the only real God. He is God with a capital G, the only one. Therefore, he is the only one truly deserving of our worship, the only one who belongs in first place of our lives. He's not just like the first of many gods. He's not the chairman of the board of gods in your life. He deserves to be and wants to be the entire board and to teach us how to orient everything else in our lives in a way that it brings glory to him. Another word for these other gods, these like small g gods, is idols. To worship another God, to put something before the Lord God, is idolatry. And I think when many of us hear that, at least at first, like we think we're good because we think we don't have idols. I mean, I don't have any like golden statues in my house. Well, actually, I don't know about Noah's room. I think, we probably do have some gold. But at least we don't like bow down to it. I don't have any statues that I worship. I also don't try to like practice Christianity like alongside other religions. So I don't have other gods in that sense either. So we think, well, I think I'm good. Like, is this commandment even all that relevant to me? But when we look closer, we see that really an idol is anything that takes God's place in our hearts. Anything. Our memo verse of the month, which we are going to memorize this month as a church, is 1 John 5:21. We've got these cards out there in the lobby if you want to pick one up. It's in the New Living Translation this time because I like how it phrases it. It says, "Dear children, keep away from anything that might take God's place in your hearts." Literally, and what the NIV says, is keep away from idols. That's what that means. And we as human beings just have a knack of turning just about anything into an idol, into something that takes the place of God in our hearts. So ask yourself, is there something in your life that can sometimes take the place of God? Something that you turn to for your hopes and your dreams, or that fuels your fears and your anxieties? What do you turn to provide you with satisfaction, with hope, with joy? What tends to make you the most disappointed? What sacrifices are you willing to make? And why? What do you talk about the most, think about the most, post the most about on social media? What really matters to you? And when I ask myself those questions, if I am honest, I have to admit that sometimes my priorities are out of order. Something else is taking God's place in my heart and in my life, at least in that moment. That's idolatry. That's sin. Now, I am not saying, and I don't believe God is saying, that we can't have like other interests, other passions, other goals, and other dreams, but only God is God. Only God deserves to be first. And when God is first, it brings everything else in our lives into alignment. Have you ever been putting on a button-down shirt like this in the morning, maybe first thing in the morning, and maybe you're tired, maybe you're still kind of half asleep, you haven't had your coffee yet or whatever, and or maybe you're just not paying attention, and you get to the end of the shirt and one side is way longer than the other. Like, Noah, come on up. I asked Noah to demonstrate. All right, you can do it that way. Demonstrate for you this way. Show them your shirt and see how one side is longer than the other. And some of you right now are looking at this and you're like, fix it, right now, fix it. You just can't stand to see it that way. But like, what happened here? Well, he didn't line up the first button, right? When you're putting in, although Lucy, my daughter, she said that she starts at the bottom and goes up. That's just weird. I mean, if you start at the top, if you line up the first button with the first hole, right, everything else will be just fine. The shirt would be properly aligned the way it's supposed to be. But get that first button wrong, everything else, it's just out of whack. It's one hole off. All right, thanks, Noah. You can go back and sit down. The idea is that we can turn practically anything into an idol. And there might be some things that immediately come into your mind. Some other things that we put in that top buttonhole. Like money, right? I mean, man, it is so easy to turn money or material wealth into an idol and let it become the source of our security and our anxiety. Any form of addiction, frankly, is a form of idolatry. Whether it's to drugs, alcohol, pornography, sex, gambling, gaming, shopping, food, social media, whatever. Success, or power, or education, or pleasure can all become idols. Some people, their idol is their sports team. Some people, their idol is a famous celebrity that they follow all the time. But I'm not going to really talk about those idols in this series, at least not very much. All of them are very common. I'm not trying to downplay that at all. But there are other kinds of idols that are a lot more sneaky because we tend to view them as good things. And they are good things. They're just not the best thing. They're not God. And if we are not careful, they can threaten to take God's place in our hearts. They're things we deal with every day. But we have to keep them in the proper priority. And that's why we're calling this series Everyday Priorities. Now, warning, this series is going to step on some toes because it gets all up in our business. It's probably going to make us uncomfortable at times. So please know that the person whose toes I'm going to step on the most are mine. I'm not like picking on anybody here. But in case you want proof that this series might make us kind of uncomfortable, here is the list of topics that we are going to cover in this series. There it is. Family, politics, religion, and self. That's quite a list, right? That's a minefield. But wait, you might be thinking, aren't we supposed to love our families? Yes, of course we are. Aren't we supposed to take care of ourselves? Yeah. I mean, does God really even care about our politics? I think he does. And religion, dude, do you not know you work for a church? That's fair. And all of that is what makes it so sneaky. These can all be really good things, important things in our lives. But to interact properly with each of these concepts, we have to get that first button right. We have to put God first and then deal with family, politics, religion, and ourselves in a way that brings God glory. Now, we're going to spend the rest of our time today talking about the idol of family. Family's a good thing, right? Like regardless of what your specific family situation is like, I think most of us would agree that family relationships are supposed to be positive. We're supposed to love our kids and love our parents and love our spouses and our siblings, right? Of course we are. God is not anti-family in any way. In fact, he tells us to love our families. The structure of our family relationships is part of God's design in creation, whether we're talking about husband-wife relationships, parent-child, whatever. So don't worry, I'm not going to stand up here on Mother's Day of all days and say that the love we have for our families isn't a good thing. Of course it is. It's very important that we seek to be good parents and grandparents and spouses or whatever. It's important that we honor our father and our mother. That's one of the 10 Commandments too, right? But that's exactly what makes it so easy to put family in the top spot, which pushes everything else out of alignment. What would you say is the most important relationship in your life? A research group called the Barna Group did a study several years ago in which they asked that question. They found that only 19% of adults in the U.S. would say that the most important relationship in their life was their relationship with God, or any kind of higher power. This wasn't just Christians that they asked. Meanwhile, 7 out of 10 adults would rank their relationship with their family, either in part or in whole, above their relationship with God. 7 out of 10. Now, I wasn't really all that surprised when I heard that, because those family bonds are strong. But if those relationships take the place in our hearts that only God deserves, that's idolatry. When the top isn't God, I think it can lead us in some unhealthy directions. But when God is in the top position, doesn't mean we don't need to love our families, continue to love our families the best we can. It means that we do that with the proper mindset, the proper priorities, with the correct alignment. When we love God first, the love we have for our families actually becomes better, greater, healthier than it would be otherwise. There is a story in the Bible that speaks to this. It's a famous story, but it makes a lot of people kind of uncomfortable. It makes me a little uncomfortable, if I'm telling the truth. It's about a dad and a son, and I'm a dad, of course. Many of you know my 3 kids: Noah, age 16, Lucy, age 12, and Lily, age 7. There they are in front of the Millennium Falcon. And when I look at this story from a dad's perspective, man, I don't know what to make of it. But if we dig deeper, I think it actually teaches us quite a lot about God and about priorities. It's all about the question, what's the most important relationship in your life? The story is found in the book of Genesis, which is the very first book of the Bible, chapter 22. The dad in the story is Abraham, and the son is Isaac. If you're not familiar with those guys, there are a few things you need to know. Abraham is an extremely important person in God's story that the Bible tells. He lived over 4,000 years ago. We're still talking about him. And he was a man of great faith in God. God had promised Abraham that he would make Abraham's family, his descendants, into a great nation. That nation would be God's special people, and God would use that nation. One of the things he would do is get the world ready for the coming of the Messiah. The only problem was, at the time, Abraham didn't have any kids yet. And he and his wife Sarah were getting old, like past childbearing years. Long story short, many years later, Abraham and Sarah did eventually have a baby, a son. They named him Isaac. And God said, Isaac is the child of promise. God's promise to make Abraham's family into a great nation would be fulfilled through Isaac and through Isaac's kids. By the time this story takes place, we're going to read today, Isaac's no longer a baby. Most scholars believe he was a teenager, maybe even like a preteen. But listen to what happens. This is Genesis 22, starting with verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He tested his faith. He gave him the opportunity to demonstrate his faith and trust in God. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. I mean, put yourself in Abraham's sandals for a second. He was probably like, what? I mean, first of all, even though this happens very, very early in the Bible, God hasn't given his law yet, human sacrifice was something God never approved of. In fact, later he would strongly condemn it. But now here he is telling Abraham to sacrifice his son, and not just any son. This was Isaac. This was the child of promise, God's promise. How did this make any sense? But that's the test. It's not only about whether Abraham would be willing to give up this son that he loved, God pointed out, the son whom you love, just because God told him to, but whether he would trust that God would somehow still keep his promise. Verse 3, early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." This is the very first use of the word worship in English translations of the Bible. Worship, in this context, means to assign ultimate value to something. When you worship, you are declaring by your words or your actions that something is of highest worth to you. It's very, very important, more important than anything else. Abraham believed that only God is ultimately worthy of worship. And that's what he was going to demonstrate on that mountain. God is essentially asking Abraham to prove that the most important relationship in Abraham's life is with God. And he's about to do just that. Something else about Abraham that I think it's important to remember, he was an extremely wealthy guy. Like by the standards of that culture, he was very well off. But that's not where God tested him. The test for Abraham came in the area of relationships, specifically this son that they'd waited so long for, the child of promise. God knew exactly how Abraham felt about Isaac. God knows exactly how you feel about your kids, your spouse, your parents, whatever. He knows how much you love them, or how deeply you desire those relationships to be healthy. But he wants and desires to be first. God knows that the more we love something, the easier it is to make into an idol. Listen, I love my kids deeply. I love my wife deeply. I love my family, and I can't imagine being asked to do what Abraham was asked to do in this story. It makes me uncomfortable to think about it. And I think that's the point. It forces me to ask myself, is God really first in my life? As Abraham and Isaac approached that specific mountain that God told him to go to, Isaac knew something was missing. Verse 7, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here." Isaac said, "But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. See, because God was first in Abraham's life, he trusted that somehow, some way, God would provide. He would make it be okay. The book of Hebrews in the New Testament tells us that Abraham reasoned that God would even raise Isaac from the dead, if that's what it took, even though something like that had not yet happened in the Bible. Notice this verse we read a few verses ago when he told his servants to stay behind. Abraham said, "We will worship, and then we will come back to you." That's how deep Abraham's trust for God ran. Now, if you don't know this story, let me finish it for you really quickly. God did indeed provide the lamb, quite literally. They got to the mountain, Abraham built the altar, and he was about to sacrifice Isaac, like the knife was in his hand, when an angel, a voice, called out to him and said, "Stop, don't do it. Here's a ram caught in a thicket. Sacrifice it." And Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. He and Isaac came down off that mountain together, and Isaac was the child of promise after all. Abraham and Isaac's descendants would eventually become the nation of Israel. And on that very same mountain, this very specific mountain that God told them about, they had to travel 3 days to get there. That very same mountain, Israel would one day build the temple, where they would hold sacrifices year after year after year to remind them of their sin and how God would provide their forgiveness. But what relationship do you think was the most important one in Abraham's life? It wasn't Isaac. It wasn't Sarah, his wife. It was the Lord, and he proved it. But what does this have to do with us? Fortunately, I don't think God is very likely to tell you or me to literally sacrifice our loved one. But I do think we might be tempted to allow family relationships to take the place of God in our hearts. Or to say it another way, maybe we expect our family to provide for needs for which only God can provide. In a sense, we expect our family to be God. Like, we usually don't think about it that way. But we seek purpose, we seek validation, we seek significance, we seek all kinds of things. And then we look to a child, or a significant other, or a parent, as the ultimate source of those things. And when we do that, it very easily becomes not only unrealistic, but unhealthy. Because they cannot possibly provide for those needs, not the way God can. They will let us down. I mean, we will let them down too. But when they let us down, we might get really upset. It might rock our entire world. We might become harshly critical. We might unfairly play the comparison game. Why can't you be more like fill in the blank? I know people, and probably so do you, who spend their entire lives trying to live up to their parents' unrealistic expectations of them. Or they want their significant other to fill a void in their heart, to provide them with affirmation. But it doesn't ever seem to be enough. Maybe their identity is so wrapped up in their kids that they don't realize the disservice they are doing to their own children by trying to live vicariously through them. Man, we all need hope. We all need joy and peace and relationships with other people, as important as those relationships are, cannot fully provide for those needs. One relationship can do that, and that's a relationship with God. As Abraham said, the Lord will provide. So, what's the most important relationship in your life? I can't answer that for you. That's between you and God. But I will say that when God is the most important relationship, when Jesus is that top button, everything else will fall into alignment. He teaches us how to love our spouses, our kids, our parents in the best way possible. So how do we make sure that Jesus stays in that top spot, that we have no other gods but God? It's simple, not easy, but simple. Choose Jesus first. One way we choose Jesus first is by spending intentional time with Jesus. Okay, I do not mean doing stuff for Jesus. I don't mean doing stuff to know more about Jesus. Those are great. They're necessary. But they're not the same thing as spending time with Jesus. It is very possible to know a lot about someone without knowing them at all. I know a lot about Paul McCartney. I do. I'm a big Beatles fan, and especially when I was younger, man, I would read whatever I could find about the Beatles. Everything my local public library had to offer. It was before the internet was easy to get. I still love the Beatles. I own all of their music. I learned to play guitar by playing Beatles songs. My kids are now also very familiar with the Beatles. I know an embarrassing amount of information about Paul McCartney's life, and John and George and Ringo, for that matter. But you know what I don't know about Paul? His phone number. I've never met him. I've never spoken to him. I've never even seen him perform live. Some of you may have. I haven't. That would be really cool. I know about Paul McCartney, but I don't know him. I don't have a relationship with him. That's not a relationship. And I think sometimes that's what we try to do with Jesus. We settle for knowing about Jesus without knowing him. But he makes himself available to us. He wants us to know him. He wants us to spend intentional time with him. And the main way we do that is prayer. I'm talking about carrying on a conversation with Jesus that lasts throughout our day. Whatever we're doing, just remembering that he's there with you. Carrying on that little conversation. Sometimes we stop and we focus on that conversation, but it's going on the whole time. Reading the Bible is part of that too. It's very important. But if we're talking about a relationship with Jesus, I think that comes first and foremost through prayer. We talk to him about what's really going on in our heart and our mind, the concerns we have with our own lives, the concerns we have that other people bring to mind. And we don't just do all the talking. We also need to leave space to listen. Let him speak into your heart. And when I do that, I often find that he helps me reset my priorities so that they look a lot more like his priorities. And he fills those needs in my life that only he can truly fill. And we also choose Jesus first by giving our lives to Jesus. And that does include repenting and being baptized into him. But even if we've already done that and said Jesus is our Lord and our Savior, we still must give our lives to him every day. That's what Jesus was talking about when he said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. It is every day saying to Jesus, you're in charge. You are in first place. And you show me how to set all of my other priorities, including you show me how to love my family well. God knew we wouldn't always get it right. That's why he sent Jesus. And God did provide the lamb for us. Just like Abraham was willing to give up his son, God gave up his son to pay the price for our sins. It's on that same mountain ridge in Moriah. On one end is the Temple Mount. On the other end of that same ridge is Calvary, where Jesus was crucified. He paid the price so that we could have a relationship now and forever with God. The Lord will provide, and the Lord has provided for us through Jesus. So give your life to him. Spend intentional time with him. Choose Jesus first. Let him teach you how to love the members of your family in the best possible way, without seeking from them what only God can provide.